Hi, everyone, and welcome to this mini lecture on the achievement gap, which is sometimes called the education gap. We'll begin by answering the question of what the achievement gap is, and then we'll pull in some information from previous weeks to help us make better sense of this topic. So, what is the achievement gap? The achievement gap refers to the disparities in academic outcomes for different groups of students. These outcomes are usually high stakes test scores, such as the SOL tests in Virginia. Many education scholars argue that our American education system is not the great equalizer, but is in fact a system that reinforces rather than overcomes our social, racial, and economic divides. In other words, the great equalizer of American education often works to produce gaps and reinforce our differences. In this mini lecture, we'll look at three factors that influence the achievement gap: race, gender, and socioeconomic status, or SOS. Excuse me, SES. There are many cultural and social factors that influence a student's achievement, but we're focusing on three. The first is race, which the school system determines by the child's skin color and ethnicity. SES, which the school determines by the child's parents' income, education, and occupation, and gender, which is a set of behaviors. Let me ask you this. What do we know as educated people about these categories? If you've taken any social science classes, or maybe if you're a sociology or anthropology major, you might say that categories are socially constructed. They are created by people, right? They are not something that is quote unquote natural or a given truth. Categories are our way of organizing and making sense of the world, and we change and modify them all the time. That is not to say that categories do not have very real consequences. We might say they are real because we experience these consequences. They have important implications for us, especially in education. I have always argued that categories are both helpful and harmful. We couldn't function very well in a world that is unorganized and chaotic. But categories work to create stereotypes and have consequences for different groups of students. The institution of education often works to reinforce the categories of race, gender, and SES in particular. Let's look at this data from the National Center for Education Statistics in 2014 on children living in poverty by race and ethnicity. Take a moment to orient yourself to the graph. Here we can see the differences in SES by race and understand why using categories has implications for groups of students. Here, we could say it is important to recognize that so many more Black, Hispanic, and Native American children than white children live in poverty. Categories can help us make a case about inequities for different groups of students. At the same time, though, we might begin to form a belief or stereotype about these groups. And how might that influence student teacher interactions in the classroom? Let's look at this graph, also from the National Center for Education Statistics, on race and ethnicity of U.S. public school students from 2003 to 2013. Take a moment to look at the key at the bottom. Notice that the x-axes are year and the y-axes are percent. Reading from the bottom up, the dark green represents students categorized as white. The next color green is students categorized as Black, and so on up to 100%. So what does this table show us? Well, we know that historically, U.S. public education was designed to serve white students. Slowly and with varying degrees of success, schools began serving different demographic groups. But it has not been that many years since school integration. Brown versus Board of Ed was 1954, and that's not that long ago. In Virginia, we might remember that Senator Harry Byrd organized something called the Massive Resistance to defy racial integration. So let's consider this. If the education system was originally created to serve one group of students, the white group, then historically it was skewed in favor of this demographic. And what do I mean by skewed? The teachers, curricula, instruction, discipline policies, test design, norming, standards, classroom expectations were all tailored to one particular demographic. This means that all other student groups had to fit in and be measured against a system not originally designed to serve their needs. In a moment, we'll take a look at some data in Virginia that illustrates the achievement gap. This information came from the Virginia Department of Education website listed at the bottom of the slide. In the first table, I ran data on males in Richmond by race and SES, and here SES is listed as disadvantaged, yes or no. I looked at passing rates for the algebra SOL test. You can see the gap in outcomes by passing rates very clearly. The passing rate for white males was about 28 points higher than for black males. Now let's add some data from one of Virginia's wealthiest counties, Loudoun County. Here again, we see a gap by race, with white males in Loudoun outperforming black males in Loudoun by 19 points. This website allows you to choose categories and school divisions you want to research. And I encourage you to visit this site if you are pursuing an education degree or perhaps want to write your paper for this course on the achievement gap. The examples here were chosen randomly, and I picked them to show you that the gap is real. If you randomly selected different data, it would likely show a similar trend, even if each and every point you looked at didn't conform to the gap statistics. So let's think about how the achievement gap works. School districts use data to group and norm different categories of students, such as Black boys, white girls, SES disadvantaged, English learners, and many more, against a normative standard, and then treats them according to how closely they measure up. So, what is the standard? The standard the groups are measured against is the mean or median test score or other indicator of performance that is created by the process of testing. Another mean or median might be the average family income for the school district. But we remember the standard usually applies to the largest and the most dominant group, and we know that that group is usually categorized as white. The achievement gap is a complex phenomenon and difficult to describe in terms of direct cause and effect. We said that categories are socially constructed, and the resulting lived experiences of different student groups deemed as deficient or not measuring up can create stereotypes and biases and affect how they are treated in the classroom. So let's look at this example from the 2014 National Center for Education Statistics report on race indicators. Take a moment to read this information. Does this conform to any stereotypes or biases you might have about certain groups of students? Perhaps you identify as one of these groups. How does this information make you feel? Let's look at another example from the same source and take a moment to read that. Does this information reinforce any stereotypes or biases you have? Or do you identify with any of these groups? How does this information make you feel? My goal in sharing this data here is not to piss you off, but to show you some examples of real world data that educators use to make policy, inform instruction, and that we use here at VCU to educate future teachers. So, let's look more closely at how educators use data to inform policy and practice. Here are some examples. The first is tracking. All of you probably know this because you were probably in the high track or college prep track in high school. Here, data are used to place students into different tracks, which are then very difficult to jump out of. Tracks are sometimes synonymous with high or advanced placement, more rigor, more difficult, and low or remedial, basic, less college prep. Next is ability grouping, and that refers to a design strategy that places students with similar skills together. This often results in less rigorous instruction and lower expectations for students who are thought to have lower skills. Data are also used to inform discipline policies, which disproportionately favor the dominant group over other groups. Taken together, these practices can lead to a negative school climate and make it an undesirable place for experienced and talented teachers. What we call a low performing school often is short staffed or staffed by teachers without credentials or perhaps new teachers who are inexperienced. I hope you can see a trend that data, which are influenced by race, SES, and gender, can work to segregate students more and more. Again, the great equalizer of education can actually start creating and reinforcing race, class, and gender differences. So, what can we do? How do we approach the complex problem of the achievement gap? Let's go back and think about educational philosophy for just a minute, and maybe that will help us understand the reasoning that underlies some of the different approaches. If you take more of a traditional perspective, you might say that we need to close the gap and begin to manage the teaching and learning more closely. A traditionalist believes that the shared common knowledge of Western canon is the standard that all children need to master. So, by bringing all students up to this level, everyone benefits. This perspective is more about changing the student to fit the school curriculum and testing system. So, let's put a T for a traditional philosophical approach here. A more progressive philosophy of education might see things a bit differently. The gap might be viewed as a disconnect between the student and school. A progressive approach would be more student centered and perhaps look at changing the system to be more accommodating to the student. So, approaches like culturally relevant curriculum might be a progressive strategy. So, we'll put a P by this idea. Still, another approach might be to question the testing process itself as unjust and biased towards the dominant group and disadvantaging all others. This approach would advocate for change to a more just and equitable system of assessment. This would be a critical philosophical approach. So I'll put a C here. Finally, an approach to raise awareness of how the gap is produced in the first place, that categories are both necessary and harmful, and that by raising awareness of how to use data responsibly, students might be better served. This is a sort of combo progressive critical approach. I'll put a P here. But by using philosophy, it helps us better understand the reasoning underlying these different approaches to the achievement gap. It is important to understand the philosophy at work when politicians and superintendents are making decisions that affect thousands of students. In this unit, you will be analyzing 2 short videos, so please take a moment to review this information again if necessary. So let's recap what we've covered. Let's go back to our categories of race, SES, and gender. We discussed the pros and cons of categories, how they help us make sense of the world and understand problems. But they also create stereotypes about groups of students, which leads to practices that ultimately reinforce our differences. The achievement gap is a complex problem, and philosophy is one way to help us better understand different approaches to addressing it. Of course, by educating future teachers, hint, hint, we can hope that our future educators will disrupt the cycle that produces the achievement gap in the first place. That means we're all counting on you guys. So, in conclusion, the achievement gap is a rich subject area that would make an excellent topic for your paper. I'm going to end this mini lecture by inviting you to watch the short video, Brooklyn Brownstone, about 2 schools in New York City. This video weaves together the ideas we've covered here in a real life context, and I think you'll find it very interesting. Enjoy the content.